150 miles northwest of Las Vegas is the Groom Lake Test Site, otherwise known as Area 51, an airbase so secret that officially it doesn't exist. It was here during the 1970s that the US Air Force began testing a revolutionary new technology. The aim was to build an aircraft invisible to radar. The technology is called stealth.
Stealth introduced two new concepts, precision and survivability. And that brought air power to an entirely new dimension. And that was demonstrated in its entirety in the Gulf War.
Any pilot that flies the F-117 stealth fighter is capable of hitting any target. If you give him a photo of a city and show him a particular house or a shed or a garage or a car, he could fly over that city, put the crosshairs on that target, and hit it.
You can imagine an attack against the United States, an attack in which, in one night, we were able to destroy the White House, destroy the National Military Command Center, to completely shut down the telephone system. CIA headquarters is destroyed. Bolling Air Force Base, Defense Intelligence Agency is destroyed. That's what the stealth did to Iraq that first night of the war.
During the Gulf War, stealth pilots launched the kind of surprise attack impossible since the invention of radar over 50 years earlier. Radar was the technological revolution of World War II. It had given the RAF the advance warning it needed during the Battle of Britain, and it has formed the first line of air defenses ever since. Radar works by sending out electromagnetic energy and receiving the signal back from the object it hits, thereby identifying its position. In the 1960s, radar became an even deadlier threat when missile launchers were equipped with radar technology. Their ability to seek and destroy resulted in heavy American losses in the Vietnam War. What's more, pilots who were busy dodging missiles had no time to concentrate on accurate bombing. The only real solution seemed to be to do the impossible, to design a plane that radar couldn't see. The first real breakthrough came in 1974 at Lockheed's Advanced Engineering Division, the Skunk Works in California. Overturning all the established theories, one man was able to unlock the secret to building the miracle plane.
Well, a friend of mine called me. He said, "You know how to make something invisible to radar?" So I said, well, there's nothing that's truly invisible, but we can do things that are very, very low. And when I was asked what kind of a shape, how do we shape something to make it invisible to radar, I said, well, it's simple. You just make it out of flat surfaces, and you tilt those flat surfaces over and cause the energy to reflect away from the radar, and the radar can't see it. And I was told promptly that I was nuts, that none of the experts say this, and I said, well, you asked. Well, but the fact of it is that it made enough sense that the company decided to go ahead and try it.
Overholser devised a computer program to demonstrate his theory, and a model, nicknamed the Hopeless Diamond, was built, based on those first principles.
I'll try and illustrate just with this simple rectangle here. First of all, if we look at a rectangle just like a mirror, we're obviously going to get a huge return because you're just shining a big radar light on it and you're getting all the light coming back at you. It's a very big signal. As we tip it backwards slowly, of course, the energy tends to bounce more off into space and it rapidly drops, so we get a much lower signature when we're down here. But we get a much more dramatic result if we turn the thing as a diamond shape. And if we now, instead of just going back on this edge, go back as a diamond and pull it back, within 8 degrees movement, a very small amount like that, it's dropped by a factor of 1,000. And as we continue, it'll go back by about another 10,000. So at this angle, it's dropped by a factor of 10 million.
I gave those numbers to the government and to the people who do threat evaluations. And They said, well, Dennis, if you can meet these levels, you have built an invincible airplane. There is no threat that can attack this that we know of today. It was a revolution. You knew it was a revolution when the government changed the security classification. They changed it from confidential to top secret overnight. I told you right away that this was one hot potato.
Proving the theory was one thing, but the real challenge was to translate it into a stealth aircraft that could actually fly. It was codenamed Have Blue.
Have Blue was designed initially back in 1975 and was solely devoted to the idea of getting the world's lowest radar cross-section. It was just like an airplane going for a speed record or something of that sort. We actually did a lot better than a lot of people thought we would do, and the consequence was that very quickly the Air Force wanted to have a real military airplane based on the same principles.
The F-117 stealth fighter, as it was called, is essentially a series of diamond-shaped flat surfaces. The finished aircraft is coated in a radar-absorbent material. This combination is so effective that to a radar, the entire plane appears no bigger than a golf ball.
When we do the basic design of the airplane with all its diamond-shaped facets, we finish up with a very low radar return. But clearly there are a number of items which are going to increase the radar return in principle unless we do something dramatic about them. Inlets are probably one of the worst things on airplanes. And the reason why is you can imagine that if energy goes into an inlet, a conventional one, not this gridded one that you see here, the radar energy runs in towards the engine and just comes out like the beam out of a lighthouse, straight back at the radar. The grids have radar-absorbing material in them. As the energy goes in, it gets absorbed like a shock absorber. And the radar energy can go in through that grid, it does not come out. The canopy, the position we're in there is that the pilot's head, just by itself, has a great deal higher radar return than we want from the entire airplane. The solution is actually a fairly simple one. We can do the same thing with the windows as we do with metallized sunglasses. So the radar energy bounces off the metallization, the pilot can see out, the radar cannot see in. All of the edges of the doors on this airplane, you will notice, are zigzag shapes or diamond shapes, and this picks up again on the theme of the diamond-shaped facet that we mentioned earlier.
Although it's called a fighter, the F-117 carries neither guns nor missiles. Its only weapons are its laser-guided bombs, carried inside the aircraft to help keep radar returns to a minimum. Its radical and unorthodox shape provides defense against radar-guided and heat-seeking missiles, but does nothing for its aerodynamics.
The airplane design is inherently unstable. It wasn't until the advent of digital flight control systems that the Stealth was able to fly as an airframe. So we very heavily rely on that technology. When I fly the airplane, unlike any other airplane I've flown, I'm not directly controlling the control surfaces. I'm giving inputs to a computer that makes the decision on how the airplane control surfaces should move.
The computer system gathers data from 4 probes mounted on the nose. If they were to fail, the plane would go out of control in 1.5 seconds. Although it makes for an unconventional-looking aircraft, Stealth frees the pilot from having to dodge enemy radar. Now he can concentrate on his main task, hitting the target.
Fighter airplanes were traditionally designed to be fast, they were designed to be maneuverable, and they were designed to fly very, very low to avoid enemy radar. With the advent of stealth, I could fly at relatively slow speeds at a high altitude and take the time to be precise and surgical with my weapons. That's what stealth technology does for you.
The US Air Force took delivery of the first of its 59 F-117s in 1982. For the next 6 years, 3 secret stealth fighter squadrons would operate under cover of darkness from Tonopah Test Range, deep in the Nevada desert.
Typically, we would fly over 6 or 7 big cities, and we would have photos of the cities, and we would have coordinates of a target, and we would do a camera attack over the city.
The guy that planned the mission for that night would just select a house in the middle of downtown Las Vegas, and that would be our target for the night. And they'd set up the runs just like you would for a reel, except naturally they were all dry. We weren't dropping any bombs or anything like that. And that was how we kind of honed our skills, because the biggest job that the pilot had in the 117 was to find the target.
The training that we got in the Nevada area and in the surrounding countryside was virtually identical to that which we would need in the Gulf War. So there was really no more perfect place we could go in the world than the Middle East.
By the time Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990, the F-117 was no longer in the Pentagon's black world of total secrecy, but it was still unproven in combat. At the end of August, the first of 42 stealth fighters arrived in Saudi Arabia to take their place in the vast military buildup that was Operation Desert Shield. As they did, plans for the next phase, Desert Storm, were already well underway. Coalition Commander-in-Chief, General Schwarzkopf, gave the task of planning the air campaign to a fellow veteran of the Vietnam War, Brigadier General Buster Glosson.
That air campaign was supposed to be as massive and as decisive as it possibly could be. And it was ideally would make it necessary for no other phases of the war campaign to occur. I made the planners ask themselves 3 questions about every target they considered. What system had the highest probability of destroying it? What system had the highest probability of the pilot coming back alive? And what system had the highest probability of no civilian casualties? The majority of the time, the answer to that was F-117. We did not have enough F-117s to put one on each one of the things we needed to do. So what I, in essence, would do is I would take the most critical targets, the most highly defended targets, in accomplishing our strategic objectives, and I would put the 117s against those particular targets. I would use all the other systems, whether they were cruise missiles or whatever type of fighter or bomber they were, as fillers. So when somebody says that the F-117 was the backbone of the strategic air campaign in the Gulf War, they're 100% correct, because everything else was built around it.
Buster Glosson's plan called for a massive display of air power. 700 aircraft would simultaneously attack targets all over Iraq and Kuwait. At the head of the air armada would be the F-117s.
The F-117's mission was to go out and hit targets that would pave the way for the non-stealthy aircraft, radar sites, air defense centers, headquarters buildings, and interceptor operation centers, so that they could not send their fighters after the non-stealthy aircraft or use their radars to track the non-stealthy aircraft and shoot them down.
Their other main target was the most heavily defended city on Earth, Baghdad. The Iraqi capital bristled with 60 radar-guided missile launchers and 1,800 anti-aircraft guns. The F-117s were the only planes that could hope to penetrate such defenses and survive. Glosson would use them to strike directly at the nerve center of Saddam Hussein's regime. At midnight on January the 15th, 1991, the deadline for an Iraqi withdrawal expired. 2 nights later, the final preparations for Operation Desert Storm began. Stealth was about to be tested against enemy radar for the first time. All the F-117 missions were pre-programmed and fed into the onboard flight computers. In fact, all the planned attacks in the first 24 hours, including those by cruise missiles and conventional aircraft, were so tightly coordinated that once they began, it would be impossible to turn any of the planes back.
I think the point of no return was flying up with the tankers up toward the Saudi-Iraqi border, and as you approached the border, you had to get your last gas so that you had enough gas to go out and go hit your targets and come back to the tankers on the other side of the border. And I remember dropping off the tanker, and at that time, I knew that I was going, because they couldn't get a hold of us after that. We basically became like a cruise missile. If they wanted to turn us around, they couldn't, because we were not in radio contact with them anymore.
My target was 60 miles over the border. It was called Nukaib. It was an IOC, or an Interceptor Operations Center. My job was to take out this underground bunker to allow the non-stealthy aircraft to get in and not be seen by radar I was the first one to drop the bomb. Nobody knew I was there until that bomb hit the ground.
That single attack had cleared a path through the Iraqi radar defenses for hundreds of non-stealthy aircraft to find their targets. Meanwhile, the first wave of 10 F-117s were heading for their main objective, Baghdad. But the Iraqi gunners had anticipated the attack.
Just after crossing the border, I could see the glow. I mean, it's a large city in the middle of a clear desert, you know, kind of like Las Vegas. You can see the glow forever. And I started seeing all the AAA starting to come out of there, you know, and you could tell it was just randomly being fired. You know, there was nothing aimed at anything. It was going all over the place. Sometimes I could hear some pops every now and then, and I'm looking outside, and then I go, this isn't smart. I'll just look in here, concentrate on the target. And then at that point, you know, it kind of got to be like you're just saying, okay, let me just get to the target and release the bomb, okay? And then after you release the bomb, I said, okay, just let me guide the bomb into the target. Just let me guide the bomb into the target, okay? And then the bomb would go off, and you go, okay, now just let me get the hell out of here. Just let me get the hell out of here. So you kind of lived in those little spaces of time.
Now, cruise missiles and anti-radar missiles fell all over Baghdad, but it was the F-117s that attacked the most crucial targets, from the telecommunication center to Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party headquarters. The final wave of planes arrived over the city just before dawn, but because they were operating in radio silence, none of the pilots could know what had taken place earlier that night.
I had the dubious distinction of being one of the last people over Baghdad on the first night of the war. As I approached the city, as I viewed the intensity of the fire, it became aware to me that this would probably be the last 5 minutes that I had alive. In the middle of the confusion of the enemy fire, of the missiles and the anti-aircraft artillery, I was able to identify the target and launched my weapon. As quickly as I had entered that fire, and as quickly as it had all developed, it was over. I looked in my rearview mirror to actually see the city of Baghdad behind me. It was still that same cauldron of anti-aircraft artillery and missiles, but in front of me was that same calm, dark night that I had when I first entered enemy territory. And not only had I survived, not only had the people that flew with me survived, but for the next 42 nights we would all be able to go through the most heavily defended areas unscathed.
As the news reached Saudi Arabia, the Air Force leadership could scarcely believe the extent of the first night's success.
It almost became eerie of how precise everything was happening. Those pilots were absolutely tremendous. And they never flinched when things got a little tough, and they did exactly what they'd been trained to do, what the technology permitted them to do. And that's why we were so successful, eye-watering successful in the first 24 hours. The world saw it on TV.
ولكن هنالك تفاوت في الأهداف. مثلا بعض محطات الطاقة الكهربائية ضربوا المصافي النفط ضربوا المفاصل الحساسة بحيث يمكن إعادة تصليحها وتشغيلها بعد وقت قصير، فيما توجد أهداف أخرى مسحوها عن الأرض. فالأهداف العسكرية تلقت ضربات أشد. المقرات المهمة مثلا مقر الاستخبارات تمت تسويته مع الأرض.
In the nights that followed, the F-117s flew through random fire over Baghdad again and again, systematically destroying communications buildings and weapons bunkers, bridges, aircraft shelters, and even the planes themselves.
The results to date of this type of attack, we have destroyed more than 70 of these hardened shelters, and quite frankly, the Iraqi aircraft are running out of places to hide. We now have reports that many of their smaller aircraft, they have moved to roads and hidden them in residential areas that are close to the airfields because they know we're not attacking civilian targets.
But the raids on Baghdad were by no means bloodless. On February the 13th, two F-117s hit the Al Firdaus bunker, a command and control target in downtown Baghdad, with pinpoint accuracy and tragic consequences. It was only later that Allied intelligence and the rest of the world discovered that the building was also being used as an air raid shelter by Iraqi civilians. 204 died. The Iraqis claimed that more than 2,000 civilians were killed in Baghdad during the war, but it was the deaths at Al Firdos that changed the course of the air campaign.
The Alfredo bunker hit gave us a major public relations and political problem. I mean, it stopped everything we were doing for about a day and a half while we paid our attention to that. And so after that, I called General Schwarzkopf, we talked about it. I said, Norm, clearly we did what we thought was right, but it turned out to be full of civilians. We've got to look at the target list a little more closely. And we got to take a look at what it is we're doing in Baghdad itself. We didn't shut down all targets in Baghdad, but I asked questions like, why are we bombing the Ba'ath Party headquarters for the 8th time? Do we think there is somebody still in the Ba'ath Party headquarters? Why are we bouncing rubble with million-dollar missiles?
General Schwarzkopf was, in my opinion, significantly restricted on what we could do after that in Baghdad. So the last three and a half weeks of the war, it was almost like pulling part of a hand behind his back. It took the pressure off of the leadership in Baghdad at a very crucial time. And that was a wrong decision.
On February the 24th, the ground war began. It lasted just 100 hours. 38 days of bombing by F-117s and the rest of the Allied aircraft had paved the way for a rapid conclusion to the war. But stealth's reputation has recently been tarnished by a very public accident and by a damning report from the United States General Accounting Office accusing Pentagon officials of overstating stealth's effectiveness. It concluded that the F-117 smart bombs had not hit their targets 80% of the time, as had been claimed, and that the true figure might be as low as 40%, something the Air Force bitterly refutes.
The GAO, when they did their report, counted sorties that were diverted for weather, canceled, or diverted for other reasons. When we did our analysis, we counted weapons that fell off the airplane versus targets that were impacted. And if you take those and multiply them out and divide them up, it comes up to 80%. Weapons off the airplane versus targets that were impacted. Now, certainly there were a lot of sorties that took off and flew and got weather canceled, diverted, and whatnot, but we don't count those. We're talking about weapons effectiveness.
The same report even went so far as to suggest that the F-117 had been detected by the very thing it was designed to beat, radar.
Stealth means that an aircraft is difficult to detect. It doesn't mean it's invisible, as popular conception would have it. And certainly the stealth can be detected. Its presence can be detected by certain types of radars. The Chinese Nanjing radar, which the Iraqis had, since they purchased military technology from hither and yon, was able to detect the stealth, or the presence of the stealth. It was later determined by American intelligence analysts, but it wasn't able to use this information effectively. They were never able to pass this information on to their other radars and to their surface-to-air missiles to attack and shoot down the stealth. So the fact that it was detected by the Nanjing, which is a fact the Navy, for example, likes to point to in criticizing the stealth since they don't have one, doesn't mean that the stealth isn't orders of magnitude better than a conventional aircraft.
One statistic has not been disputed. During the Gulf War, 42 F-117s flew 1,271 missions without loss or damage to a single aircraft. No one was more impressed than the pilots themselves.
Every day that war went on, you had to figure somebody's number was going to be up. They were shooting so many bullets, it was hard to imagine that you could fly 1,200 sorties around Iraq and Baghdad and not have somebody get hit. I mean, all you had to do was look outside sometimes. It was just amazing that we flew through all that stuff and nobody got a ding on the airplane. We had all made plans and discussed things about, you know, if anybody was killed or was lost during the war, about taking care of their family, making sure their kids got a college education, all this stuff like that beforehand. And the fact that we never had to worry about it and everybody went home glad-handing each other, and that was probably the best part of the whole thing. You couldn't script it better than that.
Tomorrow, in the final episode of this series, Decisive Weapons examines the formidable power of the samurai warriors in the 13th century. Decisive Weapons, 7 o'clock tomorrow.